So our last presenter and our last talk speaker of the day is none other than Hannah Lanfear, who has years and years of experience, not just tasting, but also teaching people how to taste. And I think we are very excited, but we are going to pass it over to Hannah.
It's now. It's filming now. Well, just to say thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for anyone tuning in at home. I thought I'd start by introducing myself so that you can trust me. I think that's an important starting point, right? And here I am as a little kid. Aren't I cute? I put that up so I felt comfy. I'm from a tiny little fishing village in the southwest coast of Cornwall, and I got thrown out of college because I wasn't going very much. I didn't enjoy it. And so they kicked me out, and I moved up to London, and the hospitality industry was this incredible job for me. You know, it provided me with family, friends, and all of this ability to learn and form a career that really became something fantastic. I got to travel the world, own a business. It's been all right. And I'm very passionate about sharing the things that I learned with other people, because I think all of us have got, you know, something that we've learned that we can share. All you need is a good smile and a can-do attitude, and you can join the hospitality industry too. Now, I'm very passionate about spirits education, and like Dean, I worked at a bar called Milk and Honey many years ago, and our education program was exceptional. I was just a snotty 20-something kid, like everybody there, but of the sort of 50 bartenders in that group at the time, all of them are still in the industry and they're at the top, and I put that down to the education program. So I really do believe in this, and I think understanding spirits is vital, because if someone walks into your bar and they want to have, I don't know, an old-fashioned, are you just going to give them the spirit from the well, or do you have the mastery of all of the spirits behind you to be able to really recommend something, or even understand how the flavor profile of these spirits might work with different cocktails for different purposes? So I think it's a really important skill. I think it's one that we really don't focus on enough. And I thought I'd just chuck in that I'm a Prince fan, because I'm more than just a spirits person, you know. I've got a personality too. We're getting to know one another. You got to know me. So here's the thing. Bartenders do already have excellent palates. We spend our whole careers learning how to balance flavor, whether it's sweet, sour, bitter. We're very good at that. But when it comes to spirits, it's far more complex than just discerning balance and being able to fit different tastes together. Now we're working with aroma, we're working with texture, we're working with length, and there's so much in the production of spirits that can complicate matters. And we don't really ever get taught how to taste. If you compare, say, wine education, people are learning to taste all the time in a very measured way. We don't really have the same approach. One of the problems with spirits that can make it very difficult is that spirits producers can use little tricks to improve things, whether it's a dash of sweetness or perhaps some colour. There's things that they can do to improve spirits that might mean that your perception of them is then slightly altered. And so what I think is important is that we learn how to see through some of those tricks, and we can really identify quality. Now, bartenders are very often called upon to judge spirits. You know, we get asked to perhaps do IWSC or different spirits competitions where your palate and your ability to taste is put to the test. But if we don't learn and train ourselves how to taste, then can we really be accurate? Can we really tell quality? Now, I do believe it's a must for us in our industry to learn how to taste with accuracy. And so why we're here today is really to share some tips and tricks about how to do this and how to do it well. But I thought I'd start with a story, because who doesn't love a story? And this story is one that really has been told and retold in many different countries. It reappears in many guises, and it is a story of the emperor's new clothes. And it's a good children's story. You've all heard it before, right? Getting some nodding here. And there's a very vain emperor who lives in a city. These two absolute ruffians come to town, and they've managed to persuade this emperor that they can make him the finest clothes that have ever been worn by a human. But there's a trick to it, and that is that if you are stupid, then you won't be able to see the fine clothes. And the emperor weighs it up, and he's like, well, everyone's going to see how wonderful I look. and he doesn't really think it through, but he says yes. And so these two ruffians go away, and they haven't got anything to make any clothes out of at all. So they take this imaginary coat to him and they put it on, and they're like, oh, you look amazing, you look dazzling, you look magnificent. And the guy is like, oh, that's so great. But he can't see the coat, and he realizes that maybe he is the stupid one because he can't see, and he's too vain to acknowledge that he can't see it. Now, here's the moral of the story. Not everything that goes in a wonderful glass decanter is worthy of that decanter. And if you take away labels, and if you take away all of the other things that you might know, like the reputation of that brand, all you're left with is that spirit in the glass. And it's about you and your ability to discern whether it's good quality or not. So I think it's very important that we understand in a systematic way, analytically, how to assess these spirits. So with that, just sort of chuck in a picture of a cute little elephant. No, I put it there for a reason. So elephants are able to smell aromas of water from 11 miles away, and water doesn't really smell of anything, so I think that's amazing. And I thought it would give us an opportunity to explore. Dean loves this cute little elephant, by the way. I can see his face. He's like, oh my gosh. I thought it was important to explore why we even have noses at all, because if you think about it, they're very strange. If you didn't have a nose, we'd think that was even stranger, but what really are they there for? They stick out of our faces. You've got two nostrils. What's the point in this? Well, they're there for two reasons, really. One of them is so that we can sniff food and decide whether it's good to eat or whether it's bad to eat. And the other one is to sniff out sexy people and decide whether they are going to smell nice, and if we want to get romantic with them. That's the whole point of our sense of smell. Humans aren't that great at smelling compared to many of the creatures found in nature. Oh gosh, that elephant's just so cute. We need to move on or I'll get stuck looking at it. Now, here's a bit that we are really good at as bartenders, and that is tastes. And I think sometimes not all of us has separated this idea of aroma and taste. But the two things together are what make up flavour, especially if we then include texture. The tastes, you'll know, sweet, savoury, bitter, spice, umami. Now these can enhance one another. And we can also then mix them together, perhaps enhancing, perhaps balancing. This is essentially what we do in cocktails. And I put up a picture of a jungle bird, because it's my favourite cocktail. I think I can reliably say that. Maybe martini. No, let's go with jungle birds. And the cocktail's so great because it mixes all of those things, and I think that's why it works so well. It's got sweet, it's got sour, it's got bitter, maybe not so much savoury, but anyway, it really does balance very, very nicely. One sip and you keep going back for more and more and more. But the problem with this is that it doesn't really get us very far with spirits, because spirits don't really have many of the tastes in them. They are, after all, distillates, and distillates are essentially aromas that, or perhaps compounds that are volatile, that when we heat a liquid and we start to boil it, to distill it, they are what will turn to vapor. And many of these flavors, or tastes as I should call them, they're not volatile and they don't come over. Sweetness is only there if you add it, if you add sugar after distillation. Perhaps you might get sweet aromas like vanilla from cask maturation, but it isn't actually a taste, it's just an aroma, a sweet smell. Bitterness tends not to be volatile. Bitter flavors are left behind in the still. You might get them if you had a macerated spirit like absinthe. So this only gets us so far, and instead we have to look at aroma. Now, we'll come back to that in a moment, but a tip from me to you, I think having taught many, many students, people can get quite stressed when it comes to aroma and tasting, especially when you're surrounded by your peers, you're trying really hard to zone in and pick out the flavors. Your brain doesn't want to explode one aroma because we are conditioned to see it as one smell. We're not trying to pick different things from it. One thing that you might have noticed across your life is that if ever you have done a huge exercise, let's say I once went for a cycle with my pal Georgie Bell, and we cycled all the way to Whitstable, which is 100k. I hate cycling 100k, by the way. That is purely a Georgie thing. I do not like it. I like to go a short distance. Anyway, we get there and we go and have fish and chips, and I swear to God, they were the most amazing fish and chips I ever had in my whole life. So I went back the next week in a car, because I'm not stupid. Went in a car, I didn't cycle, and I had the fish and chips, and I was like, they're just okay. They were much better last week. But if you are exhausted or you're hungry, you've had a lot of exercise, then your body is conditioned to want calories, and you're really ready to receive them. So your sense of smell gets heightened, and you will start seeking them out. It's not the same. I'm not telling you to go and run 10 miles before you start tasting, but many spirits experts that work in perhaps analytical tasting and distillation, they do all of their tasting before breakfast. So they'll basically do all of their tasting before noon. And if you want to get analytic results and you want to get, accurate results, I would suggest that you don't have lots of food and then start to taste. Interestingly, when you taste spirits after dinner, we always think of them as like the great digestif, having, lovely, nice time out, let's finish it with a digestif, a complex spirit. But I've noticed when tasting spirits a lot that sometimes you can taste it before the meal and it will be intricate, complex. After your meal, suddenly it just doesn't really have that zap anymore. So tasting hungry is a great tip from me to you. For anyone that gets periods, then actually this is important to know. We don't like talking about that. It gives us the ick, no? But across your cycle, the way that you are tasting is changing because your body's trying to get calories at certain times. And so I noticed this first when I was bartending because I would be making things like daiquiris and suddenly realizing, it's not quite sweet enough. I'll add a bit more sugar. Oh, it's not quite sweet enough. It must be the sugar syrup. I'll add a bit more sugar. And then I realized that it was nothing to do with the sugar syrup. It was me. My taste buds were changing. Now, it's important to name it so then you can know how to control it, right? And at certain points, you are really looking for that sweeter element in spirit. So it won't have that same intricacy at that time. So let's talk about the difference between taste and aroma, right? I said that we come back to this. Taste is the tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, savoury. That's all you can taste in your mouth. And I think we have this idea that stick it in your mouth, give it a chew, that's how you taste your food. And it's not true. Your taste buds will give you just those flavours. And I think if you've ever had perhaps the flu or a cold, then you'll be familiar with that. I can't smell anything, I can't taste anything. You can detect sweetness, sour, etc. But the problem is your sense of smell. That's what's broken. And if you are all bunged up, then you aren't able to receive it. So let's take a little look at the science of aroma. I find this really fascinating because essentially what you're doing when you are nosing something and trying to discern the qualities of a spirit is that you are sniffing, sucking up aroma molecules up through your nostrils, and you have this patch that, this is the exploded version of it, right? A patch of epithelials, and this moist patch is essentially like, they call it lock and key, where aroma molecules will get sucked up, and if that aroma molecule finds the corresponding lock, then you can smell it. And so this is a theory that I'll come to in a moment. But essentially, we are receiving these aromas and then sending signals to our olfactory bulb. Now, the really bizarre thing about your sense of smell is that it relies on memories. And that's really imperfect because when we describe smells, we're not giving them a name that exists in our language. We're attaching words from things that we've smelt in the past to it. So I might be smelling a spirit and saying, it smells vegetal, but I'm using memories of vegetables that I've smelt before to name that thing that's in the spirit. That has never seen a vegetable. So it's quite imperfect, the language that we have, but nonetheless we need to try. Now you've got two types of sense of smell. You've got orthonasal, olfaction being the word that means smelling, and retronasal olfaction. So orthonasal is when you sniff something, but if you are eating and chewing, or perhaps you've taken a sip of a spirit, you also have aroma travelling up the back of your nose as well. Now, these are the folks that won a Nobel Prize for this idea of lock and key. I really wanted to put their picture in, mainly because of the haircuts, because look how great they are. I mean, the bob. I've tried to imitate it a bit today. But this is Richard Axel and Linda Buck. And they won a Nobel Prize because we don't really know very much about aroma for this idea that your sense of smell is really about having a receptor that is a particular shape and then a specific molecule can fit in that receptor. So if the sense of smell is, or if the aroma is something that is a similar shape molecularly, then you will be able to smell it with that receptor. Now, all of us have got that ability to smell. And so often I've encountered students that are like, I can't smell, I can't do it, I can't get what other people are nosing. And to all of them, relax, I would say, but know that this is a muscle and you have to learn by trying. And just as you would never walk into a gym and try and pick up 100 kilos and hold it over your head, that would be a mad thing to do. So too, I don't think anyone should expect to come to nosing spirits being able to just do it naturally. It is, at the end of the day, possible to not have a sense of smell. And this is something called anosmia. For those of you that are too young and don't know who Michael Hutchence is, I weep for you. You have work to do. You need to go away and listen to some In Excess, okay? Very good band. But Michael Hutchence had a moment in his life where things started to really go south for him. And there's conjecture that the reason why he died was not because of this spiral of drug taking that happened in his life, which I guess can happen to famous musicians, but actually boiled down to an incident that happened in Copenhagen where he was punched in the back of the head. Now, that punch was from, I think, a security guard at a nightclub, and it severed the neurons that are taking your sense of smell from your nose to your brain. And having anosmia is a really terrible condition that can be debilitating in terms of depression, because unlike other senses, if you were to lose your sight, that day that you lost it would be the worst day. But every day after that, you'd be improving, you'd be learning how to live with that disability. In the case of your sense of smell, the day that it happened, you wouldn't really struggle with it so much. You'd be like, boff, can't smell anything, shame. But progressively, you start to realize that you can't smell sexy people anymore, and you can't enjoy fine wine, and tasting champagne doesn't work for you. You can't enjoy lovely spirits. And for someone that was a bon vivant and loved to eat fine foods, that was a horrific experience that progressively got worse and worse and worse. Now, I'm happy to tell you that it's not necessarily a very common issue. They do say that 3% of people in the US might be asnotic. But for the rest of you, it's said that humans can smell up to 1 trillion different aromas, which is indescribable numbers of smells. But what's tricky about that is learning to identify them, learning to recognize them, and then attaching the language to them. That's the difficult bit. So practice is what it takes. Practice is what it takes. And I think having a game plan to the way that you taste is really important as well. Now, in a glass of spirits, don't have one, so I'm just going to pretend. Giving it a big old swell is a really bad idea because you've got ethanol in there. And, you know, when we say a spirit is 40% ABV, that means it's 40% ethanol pretty much. Now, ethanol is a blessing to us when we taste spirits, and it's a curse at the same time because it's volatile. So ethanol wants to rise out of the glass, it wants to get out of there, and with it, as it's rising out of the glass, it will also be bringing aroma, which is great. That helps us smell. So you don't need to swirl it around like you would with wine. If you're struggling to get aroma, I would suggest rolling the glass on its side, letting that spirit coat the interior, and then you will pick up more aroma. But ethanol is a solvent, and that doesn't make it sound very sexy tasting spirits, but at the end of the day, spirits are a solvent. And that means that they have got a drying quality. Now, if you are smelling, what makes your sense of smell work is that patch of epithelials that I identified, right? It's picking up those aromas, and if it dries out, you won't be able to smell anymore. So smelling that solvent will dry out your epithelials. You need to be really careful about the way that you approach this. And I would suggest, instead of sticking your beak all the way in there and sniffing really hard, it might be better. Oh, a prop. What timing as well. That was just as I was about. That was amazing. So good. Loiter at the top of the glass, at the upper rim, and you'll find that those aromas come without the sort of aggressive solventy characteristic. You'll find them a bit brighter, a little bit, I don't hesitate to say sweeter, but they won't be coloured by that aggressive solvent aroma. So rather than loiter at the top. Top tip from me to you. And then I would suggest having a game plan. Think of it in steps: aroma, texture, and length. And it's texture that really, I think, is really, we don't think about it enough. I would go so far as to say we hardly think about it at all, unless it's rough or it isn't rough. And if it's sharp or it has prickly notes, it'd be like rough. But actually, if you really concentrate and think about what those nerve endings in your mouth are feeling, you will start to write better and better and better tasting notes. At the end of the day, it's really, if you can separate your ego and you can come to this not expecting to be great at it, but open to learning, you will get better continually for all of your career. It's when people come to this with a bit of ego and they're like, oh, I'm great at nosing, I'm great at tasting. To me, that's really disappointing because they're kind of closed off to learning. Do you find the same approach when you're working in the bar? I mean, it's true of almost everything, isn't it? It's like you have to be open to always learning.
I agree.
It's a lifelong thing. And then length. Length is really important. So when we think about aroma, I would say try and explode it. Try and work out where these different characteristics are coming from. If you're getting one whole thing, try and explode it into different parts. For example, fruit cake. That would be spice, dried fruits of different kinds, perhaps brown sugar. You can get a lot more out of it if you try and really be analytical, pick it apart. But length is something that can be a real marker of quality and is often closely linked to distillation strength. We're not talking at all about the science of production today. We're just talking about your sense of taste. But how long does that spirit persist? And I have my own way of thinking about this because it seems imperfect to be like, the spirit was short, the spirit was long, because sometimes you'll have one enduring note that keeps going for a minute or more. Does that mean that the spirit has got a really long length? Is that a good quality thing? I would say bring this idea of dimensional to it. Is it one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, where if you take a sip and it's lasting for you, does the whole of it stay or does it simplify and become one note? And that is, for me, one of the biggest markers of quality when it comes to tasting spirits. So that's your approach. I've got some tips and tricks for you. Bearing in mind that this is all about how your epithelials are performing, do not rush it. Do not nose lots of spirits and expect to be great at it. I almost think that these spirits competitions where you're supposed to smell or taste 70 spirits in a day, it's really imperfect because how can you taste accurately over so many spirits? But make sure you're hydrated and you'll find that you get a better response. Be mindful of temperature. Spirits are, after all, volatile. If you warm them, they're going to increase in their volatility. And if it's a cold room, then you'll see me sometimes holding a glass like that, trying to warm them through. So I'm getting more from the glass. And it's about being aware of these different variables and knowing how to control them a bit. And then air conditioning sucks for tasting spirits. And it wasn't until I had people sitting tasting exams and I started to realise that if I just turned off the aircon, they would be much better at tasting. And from that moment forwards, I was like, well, we'll always have the aircon off when we taste spirits. It makes a real big difference because it really dries out your back of house, as I would call it. If you've been on a long plane, you get off that plane, your sense of smell isn't going to be as good. So something to be mindful of. Know your body, know how to manipulate it to get the best results. And then when you're tasting, I would suggest use every trick that you have available to you. And I would upend the glass, rub the spirit in my hands and smell it there, because so often you'll find that a spirit has got too much of that solventy note. Maybe it's got a high bottling strength and it's really locked up. If I pour a bit in my hands, the alcohol evaporates off and then I might get a different aroma, a different note. Plus, putting it in my hands allows me to then feel if anything's been added. And I might be able to tell, is that texture, the oiliness of a pot distilled spirit that has had a long maturation and it's become really intense in its texture? Or has it just had sugar added, which totally imitates the same effect? So touching it will help. Okay, what is my next tip and trick? Arnold, be muscly. It's great for tasting. No, it's about the strength of the spirit. I don't think necessarily that you always need to add water to open a spirit up. I think it depends. But having said that, I've definitely been to whiskey bars, been poured a cask strength whiskey, and just found nothing in the glass, nothing at all. And you add a bit of water, and then you add a bit of water, and then finally, eventually, you're like, oh, okay, now I can smell something. And it's so important because what we deem to be flavour is so much of it is aroma. So know the spirit, understand, is it being shy because it's very strong? Does it need a dash of water? If you want to assess texture, I would say taste it without water first, but that old adage of adding some water to open a spirit up, certain compounds are going to be more volatile when you dilute it a little bit. And I would try every trick in the book just to see if I come at it from a different angle, is that going to change the way that it presents? Sometimes you add water and the raw material just really blooms out of the glass. So that can be an illuminating aspect. And then be mindful of the time of day. Be mindful of, is your palate in full working order? I think our sense of taste and asking us to be analytical, it's a very imperfect instrument that we have to do this. It's our palate, our sense of smell, and they are really easily manipulated. Where you process aroma is your olfactory bulbs. It's right next to part of your brain that also processes emotion. And it's so easy to trick humans in that regard. So we kind of have to try and, use every trick in the book to make it as anodyne and measured as possible. So, with all of that, given you all of my tips and tricks, I will only give you a summary now to say that being great at tasting isn't necessarily a natural gift. Some of us might be better at it than others, but almost all of us can learn this and learn how to be talented at it. It's not a destination. Consider it a work in progress. It's a constant journey of improving your skills through your own regular effort. Be humble. Don't assume that you know everything, because trust me, I've been tasting spirits now for years and years and years, and I feel like I'm still learning and I'm still growing as I do it. And be prepared to make mistakes. I have seen people who are titans in spirit categories be felled by blind tasting. It's very easy to get tricked. It's very easy to slip up. I'm not going to be cruel and point out any examples, but there are countless spirits competitions where you look at the results and you're like, geez, that's the winner? But not all of us have learned how to tell the difference between sugar additions and the texture of the distillate. So it is easy to be tricked. And practice. And you will keep getting better. So that is my tips and tricks. Thank you for coming. If you have any questions, fire them at me.
We always have questions.
That was amazing, Hannah. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I think, yes, it is a topic that should be discussed more, because certainly we're kind of the same generation bartenders, I think, most of us. And back when I started bartending, we used to have weekly blind tastings, not necessarily as a competitive element or anything, but you had to taste 5 spirits blind and say what it was. Not because of you have to learn, get 5 out of 5, but you have to learn to get that gut feeling, so that when someone tells you something and you're like, hold on. But this is not so common anymore.
Is it Anvil in Houston?
Bobby?
Yeah, Bobby Hugel's bar in Houston. They do a bartender exam where you have to taste through 50 spirits and get them right. And that's as you said, identifying what they are specifically.
You have to get all 50 correct. You can't make a mistake.
Then you pass, yeah. I mean, it's a challenge. I don't know. Maybe you can make a mistake. I don't know. I didn't do it. But
Well, tasting is very, I mean, on one side, tasting is a little bit subjective, right? If it's good or bad, if you like it or not. But certain elements of tasting is not subjective whatsoever, because there's a right and wrong. If you taste the tequila, there's certain elements of what to expect, right? And being unable to recognize that is a disadvantage for a bartender, because how will you know which spirit to put inside a cocktail if you don't understand the characteristics of
and you've got to constantly go back and retaste things as well, because your palate changes. Your memory of something might be like, that was amazing, and then you taste it now, and it's not so much that it has changed, it's just that you've changed and experienced more flavors. I find anyway.
Do you have one moment where you tasted something where you were just like, this is it, and then you learned what it was, and it's like, it wasn't that whatsoever?
I mean, I think all of us are fallible and make mistakes with tasting. It's interesting you talk about tequila, because that is a category which you can use additives, and I would say most tequilas do use additives. And so people were confused by how they can smell this lovely stuff, but it's vanilla flavouring that got added to it. And then, for example, you would have done this when you did your spirits course with me. We would have done like 3 blind tequilas. And the really good quality one, the one that was amazing in texture and its production methods, often people tripped up over it because something that had additives seemed so, it was like the Las Vegas of tequila, whereas this was much more serious. But yeah, I'm sure I've made mistakes myself. I try and forget my mistakes, you know? Like a night out that you would rather put to one side. Oh, forgot about it, don't remember.
I think I read a few years ago, there was this blind tasting about fresh orange juice versus concentrate. And it saw that most of the participants preferred the concentrate because that's what they recognized.
Mad, yeah.
And it's all about what we get used to.
Yeah, it's almost like tasting is nostalgia. Like you're kicking into memory and feeling. So you're constantly drawing up old things. So if you're used to something and you consistently get it, and you've got a good experience around it, you know, like breakfast time is amazing, and I always associate orange juice with breakfast time. So I've got certain feelings about it, but it might be that connects people to lesser orange juice, the better experiences that they've had having had it. Does that make sense?
Well, there's like experiences of people tasting gin and tonics as well, and the ones that are the most familiar are the ones that come out as the best, because you attach, and it's an emotion, isn't it? It's like, that's familiar. I remember drinking that with my auntie or whatever it is.
And so, for example, do you see that when people come when you do trainings, when people come in from a wine side versus coming from a bar side, do they have different expectations, but also different rhetorics?
100%. Yeah, because people that are really accustomed to tasting wine will be really florid with the way that they describe things. You know, they'll use all kinds of language, all sorts of fruits, all sorts of flowers. They're really specific. And then spirits folk tend to be a bit more boxed in. But then what bartenders have that the wine folk don't have is a really strong understanding of spirits. You know, they can recognize them. And at the end of the day, recognizing the spirit category is really helpful, because then you know what it was made from, how, you know, what could be there. So you have a starting point. It's almost like having a map, not a great map, but at least a starting point of a map. And then it's easier to feel your way around. So I find that with a lot of experience now, tasting a spirit is like, right, I've got that baseline of I know roughly what it is, and then you work from there. But yeah, I did do spirits courses for wine people a lot, because it used to be part of the WSET diploma, and it was wild, that difference in the way that we think.
And also how sometimes you can do the wine tastings and just by smelling. I mean, it's ironic that it's called tasting when it's just smelling, but you can't really apply the same thing with a spirit. It's my opinion, only because if you only know the spirit, there are some spirits that are very easy to mix up.
Yeah, you can easily get mixed up. I've got a question coming in from online. Is that all right? It's from Alban. You mentioned the sense of smell is a muscle, but how do I create a plan for improving my sense of smell?
Yeah, let's say that was definitely an analogy. Don't take away that it's an actual muscle. Like trying to flex my sense of smell. I think it's really setting yourself some tests. And for example, when I worked at Milk and Honey with junior bartenders, I would often get different spirits together, put them down in front of them, and we would work through them. So for me, things like spotting rye grain was something that I had struggled to do. I wanted to understand it. So I taste a rye vodka, we taste a bourbon that was high in rye, we taste 100% malted rye whiskey, and, you know, really try and spot the continuity between them. Continuity? There you go. So different things like that, you know, you can set yourself challenges. And I remember I worked with Angus Winchester once, and this is a really sneaky move, actually. He gave me 2 glasses that had the same spirit in them and was like, taste them. And the object was to show you that your sense of smell is so fallible by what someone else is trying to indicate to you. Like, oh yeah, these are 2 different things. And you are looking, you're searching for a difference between them. And if you are searching for a difference between them, you're probably going to find them. So I think just setting yourself little challenges, constantly be tasting the back bar. I think I'm not advocating for depleting your stock or drinking it on shift, but tasting constantly is really important. And if you don't know how to describe the difference between your Woodford Reserve and your Wild Turkey, put them side by side and taste through them, try and understand them, try and put into words why they're different. And it's really exploring that language. And I think I'm kind of through the other side of teaching about spirits in a very, very structured way. But there's something quite valuable to trying to spot the qualities of what came from, what it's made from, the raw material, what could be created by the fermentation, what could be coming from the cask, and trying to break it down so that when you do then start tasting completely blind, you've got an idea of where these aromas and flavours are coming from. And it's so complex. Like, you start adding maturation and age and time in cask. It's just a really fascinating thing to get good at. You know, you're constantly learning, and I love that for it. Love it for that.
I've got a quick question, and it's related to actually physically tasting. So if you're pouring a spirit into a tasting glass, how long would you let it sit there? Because I used to, do tastings, and I'd pour it and let it sit, 7 or 8 minutes. When you compare that to a freshly poured spirit, they almost nose and taste completely different.
Yeah, I actually meant to talk about that, so I'm glad that you asked. They do really change in the glass. They do really change in the glass. And some spirits will deplete where they started off really vibrant, really energetic, had a certain selection of aromas, and then you go back to them half an hour later and it's all gone. But others will retain that and keep that intensity, keep that 3D quality. And there isn't a simple answer. I can't say every time you taste, do exactly this. But I think being aware of how a spirit might dissipate, or if it just needs to open up. Like, sometimes you put your nose in there and you realise you're getting nothing, give it 10 minutes, come back to it in a quarter of an hour. And it's not really a regimen, it's more just getting a feel for what could be going wrong for you, and then a plan of how to improve the situation.
And I think
Didn't
also
answer, did I? Just
you
like
did.
sidestepped
Yeah, you
it.
did. Yeah. No, you said just. But basically, everything's practice. You want to get good at
Yeah.
something, you got to keep practicing it, and get a feel for it. If is Kevin in here? He's the most organised person. He'd probably take notes.
Yeah, Kev.
But also, I think it's for a lot of bartenders, it's just very useful to understand how a tasting can be led in the sense of how it can be manipulated, what you come out thinking afterwards, using either temperature, either like the order of where you're tasting, all of these tips and tricks that we've all experienced.
If you're a brand ambassador and you're doing a comparative tasting with your product against someone else's product, pour yours about 8 to 10 minutes before you pour the other product. Pour the other product right in front of everyone's eyes because they see you holding someone else's bottle, but it tastes much more aggressive. Just throwing it out there. yours will taste better. In case you're
Former
interested.
brand ambassador.
Former brand ambassador of multiple different brands. I'm not going to tell you which one we did that with, but yeah.
Sneaky.
Anyways, my point was more the value of tasting in your own time and developing this confidence so that you cannot be pressurized into thinking something else just based on other people's opinions. Because for me, at least that was one of the really valuable things in my career when, you know, eventually I learned how to say like, no, actually, I think I'm tasting this. And everybody would say, no, you're stupid anyway. So like, you're just young or you're just whatever. And then eventually you kind of realize that you're right. Or not right, but what you taste. So even if everybody else loves it and you don't, that's fine.
Yeah. And I just think it's so important that we do take the time to do this, because in the modern era of bartending, we've moved towards batching cocktails quite often and elements coming together in large quantities before the shift maybe, and moved away perhaps from tailor-making cocktails constantly. And I think there's a risk there of bartenders not getting that experience of knowing why they might use different spirits for different roles. And that's something that's truly personal to you, isn't it? Of like, I like to use Petotsky vodka in a martini because I love the texture, or whatever it might be. You're creating a body of wealth of knowledge that you can share and utilize. So yeah, I think it's so important, and especially right now, like, we can't lose those skills because it's part of what bartending is. At the end of the day, we're curating these spirits on our bar. We are the mouthpieces for them.
Any more questions from the floor?
I have the question. But sometimes when we have tasting and like sommelier, someone saying, you will feel the aroma of, thank you. You will feel the aroma of peach or something like that. And everyone starts feeling this aroma. Does it work like mental, like our brain working like that? Or how does it work?
You've got these...
Or sommelier really found this taste and everyone after starting finding it. Or it's just like mental trick and they say, oh, you feel here leather, and everyone feel leather. So
Sure. I think two things are happening there. First of all, we are very easily tricked, for sure. You know, we hear someone talking, we're inclined to want to agree or believe them. But at the same time, finding an aroma and learning to identify it and name it is like cutting a pathway through a jungle. And once you cut that pathway and you found that aroma, in future you're going to find it easier to do it. And I think if someone else makes that suggestion, then you can attach the two. And it is often the case that someone says bananas and you're like, oh yeah. So actually tasting with other people is great because you're benefiting from their pathways that they've cut in their brain to finding aromas. So while, yeah, sometimes we can be misled, I think actually tasting with other people is a great way of exploring new aromas.
but in the same time, is it good for my experience when you say me, where is the banana? And they say, oh, I'm looking only for the banana. Or it's better not to listen and I'm finding my own aromas and my own feelings. How is better to train and to introduce myself?
I think learning with other people is fantastic. None of us learn to bartend in isolation. We learn from the people around us, picking up their skills, picking up their tips. So definitely learning with other people is a great way forward. But then learning to practice those skills on your own, that's having, you know, taken that knowledge and then putting them into practice. And it's a bit like teaching, because when you learn something for yourself, you might know it 50%, but if you have to teach someone else about it, you have to know it 100%. So once you start using that knowledge for yourself independently, then you really are developing that skill and you become stronger and stronger and stronger, for sure.
I think the last question of the day is like, so how many flavors, how many ingredients can you taste? No, I'm joking.
A trillion.
How many ingredients in Campari can you actually pick?
Oh.
No, I'm joking.
I can pick out delicious. Does that
Yes, that's 100% of the flavor, actually.
There's no way you could actually recognize a trillion flavors, because if you think about the math on that, like a billion seconds is 34 years. So times what, 1,000 or something? How many billions are in a trillion? Is it 100? I
I'll
have no
find you
idea.
the names
But
of
it's
the
more than
scientists.
that, right? Even if it was 10, it'd still be 340 years, right?
I'll get you that email
So you couldn't
addresses.
say the amount of flavors. You wouldn't be able to physically say them.
If you double,
Unless you lived for 340 years.
what if you say it faster?
I don't know. It's just numbers, you know. I'm a numbers guy. I like numbers.
Last question.
Oh.
Basically, just when is the best time to taste?
Early.
Early in the day?
Early.
Because bartenders are usually up late.
That's your early.
And then you sleep like 5 hours.
Early in
and
your
then
day.
8 o'clock in the morning is very...
Yeah, I think when you're hydrated, when you're not hungover, when you've woken up and your brain is fresh, I think it's the best time to learn, no? When you've just woken up, that's the best time to read and retain information, and I think your brain's sort of alive to that. And if you've eaten a lot, especially if you've eaten powerful, flavoured food, your sense of smell is going to be diminished. So I think whatever early is to you, then.
And I like breakfast before.
Who
Or no
eats
breakfast
breakfast?
at all.
You eat breakfast. You love breakfast.
Not anymore.
Oh, really?
No. I used to love breakfast, but now I like intermittent fasting, you know.
Now you just
But
love
I'll tell you what,
orange juice smells.
since I started fasting and only eating at lunchtime, that lunch tastes really good. Yeah, it does taste considerably better. I can taste more.
Most of the distillers that I've worked with over the years, they always say that. So their workday starts at 8, but they do most of the tasting between 10 and 12. So before lunch, but then a few hours after they've woken up, so they kind of woken up, all of the senses. And then after lunch, they never do any tasting that has any decision making behind it.
That sounds like a great work day to me, clocked off by lunchtime.
Well, you still have the paperwork.
No.
Okay.
All right.
How are we feeling? We're good?
I think
That was amazing.
Let's
Thank
say
you very much.